All right, maybe let's do a little more commentary. I was about halfway through biblical series 4. We're talking about Adam and Eve. He was just talking about food. Um, this is some fun stuff.
So, it's not that unreasonable to think that there's a spirit in food, because food rejuvenates, and it just doesn't rejuvenate you physically, it rejuvenates you spiritually. And then, of course, there's the other things that we consume that aren't exactly like food, that have a walloping spiritual impact, like
I love how he says walloping. Walloping is a word he uses with a lot of wallop.
alcohol, let's say, which is a spirit and is regarded, it's Dionysius, right? I mean, it's the god of the vine, and the god of the vine possesses you and makes you act all the fun ways that alcohol makes you act, the fun ways that you regret the next day. And so there's the spiritual element of that too.
And he's here talking about kind of the phenomenology of the language of spirit, and I think this is a really excellent point. Again, part of what happened in the Enlightenment is we became extremely dismissive and a little bit self-righteous about our language and about how we use it. And we can get into the ontology of spirit and what all is happening, but Jordan Peterson makes the point here that, well, we get some food in our stomach and we act more sane. We get enough alcohol in our stomach and we act all crazy. What's going on with this? And of course, the ancients, describe this as spirit, but at the same time, the ancients were fully aware that alcohol, which we still call spirits, is part of the chemical process. They weren't stupid, but what they were doing is tying their entire world together. And part of kind of what's been fun about doing this commentary series is that I've now been watching Peterson for 9 months and studying him pretty in-depthly, and now doing videos for 4 months. And as I continue to do my research, as I continue to read, try and read behind him, I've had to have a huge, if you want to understand Peterson, you're going to have to learn something about Jung. That's been really helpful in terms of understanding how Peterson uses language. So when Peterson is getting into this, figuring out how to synchronize his use of terms with other conventional standard terms. So when he's talking about spirit, when he's doing that now within a contemporary, much more scientific, perhaps even scientistic frame, figuring out how this connects, and then of course seeing Peterson do it and trying to figure out, okay, how does this connect with my map of the world? This is, again, I find this project very, very fulfilling and enlightening. And he's about to make a comment which is something that I'd never heard of before. And again, part of what's fun about going through these videos again is that I hear things now that I don't remember hearing before, although of course he said them because I know I listened to them, but also now I can understand them in a different way, having learned everything that I've learned in the past, and which is one of the coolest things about being a lifelong learner. So I'll shut up.
But there's something even deeper that I think is so cool that's associated with food and information, because the story of Adam and Eve represents the fruit as producing a psychological transformation. And so the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is an abstraction across trees, and it's trying to say, here's something that's common across trees. It's a fruit that's common across trees. It's something like that. And so the fruit that's common across trees is something you might call food. Fair enough, that's a generalization. But here's something that's even more cool. The food that's stable across the entire domain of food isn't food, it's information. It's information. And we use the same bloody circuits in our brain to forage for information that squirrels use to forage for food, that animals use to forage for food.
And now see, I'm not a scientist, so I don't know what he says, what he says, the same circuits. And I've heard enough now since I've been doing the videos, some kvetching from people who do know some science. Well, same circuits, blah, 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 blah. But the point is interesting because I can't, of course, evaluate this as a biologist. But when I look at myself, I think, yeah, my relationship to information and my relationship to food are eerily similar. And I am I'm in talking to other people, people will sometimes comment to me, boy, you really do devour information. And I do. And thank goodness the devouring information isn't one of the 7 deadly sins as devouring food is. But this is a really amazing point, something I'd never thought of. But once you hear it, you say, yeah, that really sounds right. And again, this is part of the reason I think he's having the impact he's having with respect to people reading the Bible in a new way. And even though I've got some complaints about his treatment of the Bible, especially over and against, say, the historical grammatical tradition in which I've been educated, what he's bringing to the Bible is a lot of really interesting, fresh insight that is coming from a very different direction. And I can't say that it isn't true. It's amazing it's in the text, and so that kind of opens up a new avenue and a new view of the text. Now, what's important to recognize that if, again, you're educated in the historical, grammatical, historical, interpretive method of the text, one ought not to be idolatrous with respect to that method. Implicit in, say, the Christian doctrine of inspiration of the scriptures is that this is something beyond us. And that's what kind of makes Peterson's theories about the evolutionary development of the text really fascinating. And again, I listened to this, listening to this stuff again, it's like, oh, I can understand why I got so fascinated with this the first time. And now having delved into the transliminal videos and delved into Peterson's book and continued to converse with many of you in the comment section, it's very fruitful. I see I'm using the word fruitful.
The same circuit. And why is that? Because we figured out that knowing where knowing where the food is more important than having the food. And so knowing where the food is a form of meta-food. Information is a form of meta-food. And well, that's why we're information foragers. And so once you grasp that, and that idea is embedded into the story of Adam and Eve. So whatever it is that they ingest is a form of meta-food. It's information.
And that, again, I think that's just a dead-on correct insight into the text, that when he says it, I think, it should be so obvious. People in their skepticism have talked about this story, so he eats the fruit, and no, it's not an apple. The fruit isn't specified. He eats the fruit, and his eyes are open. And so sometimes, in a dismissive sense, we look at that and say, "Oh, that's magical." No, it's not magical. Or another sense, implicitly, we've been reading the text for a long time, trying to make sense of it, and so many people kind of default to Adam and Eve broke a rule. Okay, yeah, it certainly was disobedience, certainly was rebellion. But again, this angle that Peterson comes at the text with this and says, isn't it interesting the way this food can easily be connected to with information? Because he says, we are foragers of information, and what do we say? Give a man a fish, and my silly dog wants to go outside. Give a dog some hands, and he can open the door for himself. Just like the raptor in Jurassic Park. You don't need to go outside. But here you have, the connection between fruit and knowledge. Give a man a fish, he'll eat for a day. Teach a man to fish. Well, what are you giving him when you're teaching him? You're giving him knowledge. You're giving him information. You're telling him how to get the fish. You're setting all this up for him. Yeah, this is, again, after the current affairs piece and some of the other hit pieces. Well, people want to say, he's the stupid man, smart man. I'm sorry. I've been reading this text all my life, and when he says it this way, I think, oh, that's new. Okay, so he's got my attention. But then the more I think about it, I think, there's something there. This isn't nothing that he's giving us. And then look at it in terms of the effects. Again, almost every day I get an email or a message from someone who says, I'd thrown away the Bible, I'd thrown away Christianity. I listened to Jordan Peterson, and I'm giving it another look. And I think, yeah, you listen to this stuff, and you say, yeah, you should. Yeah, the dog won. I let him out.
And we'll trade food for information, right? So if you're stuck on the edge of the highway and your hood's up and your going places thing has turned into a pile of junk that you don't understand, and somebody pulls up beside you and they're a mechanic and they point to something and say, well, just put that wire back on there, you'll immediately give them a sandwich, right? Or you'll offer them something in return, you know what I mean? Because they've provided you with information that has value. And it has value because it actually provides you with energy, because information provides you with energy, because otherwise why would we bother with it? And so food provides energy, but so does information. And so there's the idea of food that you abstract from everything you can eat, but then there's the idea of what you could abstract from all sources of food, and the answer to that would be information. And the trees that are being referred to in Adam and Eve are these meta trees. They're not ordinary trees, just like paradise is no ordinary place, just like Adam and Eve are no ordinary people, and just like the logos that God is using at the beginning of time is no ordinary conception. And they're not metaphors, they're more than metaphors. I think of them as hyper-realities, it's something like that. They're more real than what you see, they're more real than the reality that presents itself to you. And lots of things are like that, right? Numbers are like that. We wouldn't think or abstract if there weren't things that were more real than what we can see. So what's most real? Well, that's...
And again, this is good. This is really helpful stuff. And as a preacher, I'm always foraging for information. I'm foraging for information about the Bible. And when I heard about this, I thought, I'm not getting this from any commentary. So there's something worthwhile to listen to here.
That's partly what we're trying to figure out. And out of the ground made the Lord God to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food.
And you know, the part of the frustration is he doesn't touch on everything. Well, how could he touch on everything? These videos are already very long and they go on for a long time. You always have to select, and as a preacher, I always make a selection. But I'd love to sit down and say, okay, well, let's talk about some of these other elements. But maybe that's just my job.
The tree of life, also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And a river went out of Eden to water the garden, and from thence it was parted and became into 4 heads. That's produced a tremendous amount of speculation. Now, the Garden of Eden is also the holy city.
Well, one of the things, I should talk about that, what is just about, but one of the things that's very interesting, if you look at the history of cartology, before the modern era, medieval map makers often put the Garden of Eden onto their maps. And you think about, well, contemporary people won't put the Garden of Eden onto their maps. And let alone that's just indicative of the assumptions behind our representations of the world and why that changed and how that changed. And to a great degree, that gets into the question of how we read the Bible and what we understand knowledge or information to be. Now Peterson's going on to something quite interesting. Let's hear where he goes.
That's another way of thinking about it. Or it's Jerusalem, right? Or it's the ideal state, which could be the ideal city, or it could be an ideal state of being, or it could be the ideal psyche. Or it's all of those things stacked up at the same time, right? And this is a Mandela, and this is the Mandela form that people, what would you call, hypothesis?
Okay. Garden of Eden as New Jerusalem. I would say connected. Sometimes we say, at least for the Christian scriptures, the story begins in a garden and ends in a city. But as I said before, I think if you understand Genesis 1 is kind of the representation of God's, it's a temple text. Again, back to John Walton. It's a temple text. And the entire cosmos is his temple. And the earth, as the psalmist will say often, is his footstool. And so then, in that sense, the Garden of Eden is the royal garden. They're the gardens from the palace of Versailles. They're Nebuchadnezzar's hanging gardens. And so when the Lord, for example, in Genesis 3, walks through the garden in the cool of the day, well, we almost have the picture of Nebuchadnezzar who walks through the garden in the cool of the day. This is the place where the king displays his glory, or certain aspects of his glory. So for example, in the West, you look at the Palace of Versailles, and people travel from all over to see the gardens of the Palace of Versailles. And so they're the man and the woman. They are, in a sense, the gardeners, and they work on behalf of the king, and they work at the behest of the king, which makes the rebellion that comes in Genesis 3 all the more surprising when they rebel against the king and the king doesn't immediately kill them, because that's certainly what the Nebuchadnezzar that we find in the book of Daniel would have done. So yes, the Garden of Eden is an idealized place. It's a place of perfection. As Peterson says, there is chaos in the garden, and John Walton makes the point that the serpent is a chaos creature. And this I think is a helpful addition to the conversation that John Walton has made, but also Jordan Peterson here, in terms of, so often, I think, to a certain degree, in the Reformed telling of the story, it's all about good and evil, or it's all about good and evil, and so the garden is good, and then evil comes in, and you have to ask, well, where did evil come in, and how about the serpent and that? Well, there's in a sense, there's good, evil, and chaos. And if you listen to John Walton's of the lost world of Adam and Eve, the lost world of Genesis 1, John Walton starts working with those ideas. Now you might say, well, that's stretching some of the traditional ideas within Reformed theology, and I would say that's within the bounds, because part of how Reformed confessionalism is supposed to work is that, our confessional documents should be stretched by Scripture. And so what we're seeing now, as we know a lot more about the ancient Near East than, let's say, they knew in the 16th century, and we have a capacity to understand the text in a different way, that, okay, so how does chaos then function? And then obviously, as I said in some of my earlier commentary videos, you get all the way to the end of the text and you get to the book of Revelation, and there isn't any sea. Well, why isn't there any sea? And there's no sun and moon, because the light of the sun, the Son of Man, the light of God, lights the day. So Garden of Eden as New Jerusalem, as Jerusalem, and then as New Jerusalem, I'd say they're connected. They're certainly not identical.
Emphasized that constituted the structure of paradise. He knows it's got this cross form. That's Eden itself, and there's the center of Eden, and there's the rivers. Those are rivers, not snakes. Those are the rivers that go out of it. And they're turned into these Mandela images that are representative of what Jung described as the self, which would be the center element of being that he associated, of conscious being that he associated with divinity, I would say, but also with the idea of the holy city. And so,
I'm not sure what to make of it. I don't know enough Jung to really figure out how to navigate that.
I'm just showing you that to show you where the imagination has taken ideas of paradise. So,
well, and this one here with, okay, so you've got the four rivers, but look who's at the center. This is Christ. This is the victorious Lamb. If Jonathan Peugeot was here, he could help me, but he isn't. You've got four scribes. I don't know if these are, I can't really tell if these are gospel writers, but this is, I'm by no means, I'm trained in the historical grammatical Protestant seminary where we didn't look at pictures like this, and this, you don't have time to study everything, but this is really interesting stuff for me.
The name of the first river is Pison, that is which compasseth the whole land of Havilah, where there is gold, and the gold of that land is good. There is bdellium and the onyx stone. And the name of the second river is Gihon, the same is it that compasseth the whole land of Ethiopia. And the name of the third river is Hiddekel, or Hiddekel, I don't know. That is it which goeth towards the east of Assyria, and the fourth river is the Euphrates. So there's this strange...
Well, I think before we go on from that, what's helpful here is that it's quite clear that the text is orienting the garden within the world of the listener. Now it's difficult to know who, at what point the book was formed in its present form, but to what communities the book had been used in its formation process. But clearly the garden is set within the mental map and geographical map of its listeners. And so there's a symbolic level here, but there's also a geographical layer here. And so to figure out how this all works, don't know, but I think I just wanted to pause and make that point.
Intermingling there of geography with mythical geography. Yep,
there you go.
Which you see happen fairly frequently in the books. And the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to dress it and keep it. Okay, so that's a good.
And again, this again is my idea that the garden is the palace garden. The palace, the temple Genesis 1 is a temple text. Genesis 2, we in a sense have the garden, and this is where the man is located. And the Lord took the man. That's pretty that's pretty object-like. The man didn't say, "Oh, this is where I want to live." No, this is the Lord took him.
Command, that's what you're supposed to do, is take care of the damn thing. It was
well, and one of the things that I would add to Peterson here is the concept of glory, and I realize that this is coming from Reformed theology, the shorter Westminster Catechism. What is the chief end of man? To glorify God and enjoy Him forever. God makes the world for glory, and so the garden is made for glory, and a palace garden is made for glory. And so the role of the gardener, what do gardeners do? They take things that are wild and they, again, Tolkien's language, they subcreate. The apples that we enjoy today are not natural apples, and you go to the supermarket and they'll say organic apples. Well, there's nothing aboriginal about these apples. We have been tending them, and we have been accentuating that fruit to produce the qualities that we like, and we have been doing this throughout the world. And as the points that I've made in, say, after reading the book 1493, we've been doing this for forever, and we've been terraforming this world for a very long time, molding it and shaping it to our liking. So in that sense, we are very much gardeners, and we garden for glory. Now, in our fallen sense, we have real issues with glory. And if you go back and look at my sermon I made a couple of months ago, a number of weeks ago, where I talked quite a bit about glory. So what is the role? What is the relationship of the man to the garden and the God? Well, he is a glory maker. He is a sub-creator, and he's to take the raw material God gives him and make glory out of it. Paul Schrader is a Hollywood filmmaker. He made Hardcore a number of years ago. He grew up in the Christian Reformed Church, went to Calvin College, my alma mater, left, I don't know, to the degree that I don't think he left the faith. I think he's still going to church. He's not going to a Christian Reformed Church. But he also made Mosquito Coast. And the crazy man played by Harrison Ford in Mosquito Coast says something which Schrader, which comes right out of Reformed theology. God made the world unfinished. Well, unfinished, that's where we get into the sense of potential, where the job of the man and the woman in the garden is to bring the garden to its glorified potential. You see this in Isaiah 5 with the parable of the vineyard, that God sets the thing up, and what the workers of the vineyard to do are to not only produce good grapes, but the grapes are to produce wine, and wine is an object of glory. And so you read about wine in the book of Proverbs and in the Old Testament, and the feasting in the New Testament. Wine is for glory. Now, I think wine absolutely epitomizes humanity's difficulties with glory, and that, wine is made for glory, and wine is full of glory, but we can't handle glory just like we can't handle wine, and we are corrupted by it. And so this is where you get into Tolkien's themes of the ring and grasping and corruption.
A lot of work to make, right? Took a whole week. And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, of every tree of the garden thou mayest freely eat. But of the tree...
I really don't know why he uses the King James Version with this. There are... yeah. If I had a long time to talk to Peterson, I would talk to him about the choice of Bible translation he's using. That in and of itself is a rather complicated conversation, and probably one that he's not familiar with, given his background or lack of background in terms of formal biblical studies. King James translation, it is what it is. It's a very old translation. They didn't have all the text we have then. They had certain linguistic assumptions that are built into the text, and some of the Northrop Frye stuff is fun to listen to on this count.
Of the knowledge of good and evil, thou shalt not eat of it, for in the day that thou eatest thereof, thou shalt surely die. Well, there's this bunch of questions there that people have been puzzling over for a long time.
There sure are. So let's hear what you have to say.
God, he's a tricky character in the story of Adam and Eve. It's like, well, okay, if we can't eat the damn thing, well, why put it in the garden to begin with? That would be one question. And you made us, and then you told us not to eat this, knowing perfectly well that the first thing we were going to do is eat it, because people are exactly that type, which is that if you say to them with their insatiable curiosity, this is all fine and nice, but over here is something you should never look at, and then you leave the room, it's like everybody's over there instantly, right? Because we're curious creatures. And so you have to wonder exactly what God was up to here. And there's Gnostic speculation that the original God, this one, was not really a very good God. He was kind of an unconscious evil God, and that he wanted his creation to be unconscious, and so forbade them from developing consciousness, and that it was a higher God who, and maybe in the form of the serpent, who tempted human beings towards consciousness. And you know, that idea got scrubbed out of classic Christianity pretty early, although there's something that's interesting about it, and there are remnants of it in different forms that stayed inside the story.
Well, that last, I mean, everything you said is very interesting up until that last sentence, remnants of it that stayed early in the story. You'd have to say that some of that stuff was in the story, and that's where the Gnostics got it. So I'm gonna pause there. I'm at minute 10:54, so I can remember next time. And yeah, when I get a few minutes to continue doing this commentary series, I will, or maybe I'll keep doing it.